I'm really happy to get to be here with Molly today. So I'll give a few words and then Molly can kick off, but I'm Clements. I was class of 2011 here at William & Mary. I did the film and media studies major was different while I was here. So it was like literary and cultural studies with a concentration in film. So I got to take a lot of classes with, film studies faculty, but in English, American studies, I had a French minor. So a lot of that kind of interwove of classes in like French cinema and French journalism and whatnot. So there was kind of a whole mix while I was here, and a whole mix that kind of led into where I am now, and I think the education of, where I was headed next. And also this, we'll touch a little bit on, I know the title of this said undergraduate research. We'll kind of touch upon the various definitions that can have. And I admit I had to ask Dan over here, like making sure I understood the correct definition of what we were talking about. But a lot of this will be structured around a project that I did when I was a 1693 scholar here at the college. And it was combined with being my thesis project. So it was a production-based project within a program that, coursework-wise didn't necessarily have a ton of production classes. I was really glad that I got to work with what was called Film 306 at the time. It was the one production class, and cool, we've got some people now. Hi, people who are on Zoom.
The unfortunate thing is they book these back to back. We only have one person. That's much big running.
Yeah. That's not Zoom. This room is haunted.
I mean, that's to be expected also, I think. Oh, wait, no.
The ghost of Earl Grey.
All right, I think we're good. Cool. Yeah, so, really happy to get to talk, and I'm really grateful. So we won't really be using the screen very much other than thanks to like wonderful Swim and how wonderfully organized they are. This whole production diary here that I thought was like lost to some Dell laptop that I had circa 2011 is actually here, which I'm delighted by. So a few things when Molly and I were kind of coming up with notes and thoughts are actually here that just felt like they were kind of a nice jumping off point for some of the kind of illustrating the points. But now I'm really happy. Oh, and I guess, so now I did my master's in cinema studies in New York at NYU, and then kind of took a unexpected different path slightly, still working within the creative arts, but I've worked in theater for the past 10 years or so in New York. So as a, initially kind of in like a marketing role, I did a lot of cold calling early on. That was terrible in like a group sales capacity. And then a few different roles kind of throughout productions, and now have had a co-producer role on a few different shows. Taking up most of my time, the musical Dear Evan Hansen and the iterations of that are on Broadway, on tour across North America, and the London production, and kind of have a hand in those different elements. But then also have done some co-producing and like fundraising on my own. We have a few things in here that kind of touch on the impact and helpfulness of even like related to research and sort of being a steward for funds and sort of the responsibility and transparency there, which I know has been hugely helpful, more than I would have ever expected in this creative career where that kind of always will circle back. But now I have the great pleasure of being joined by Molly to kind of help facilitate a conversation, but then again, for any of you to jump in also and ask questions or make comments, but we'll let Molly give kind of a brief introduction of who she is and what she's up to right now.
So I'm a senior. I study film and media studies and a self-designed major in environmental humanities. So it's kind of bridging this gap between the arts and sciences. I also am a 1693 scholar and engaged in a project similar to what Caitlin did when she was a student here, where I made a documentary short this past semester as my research project. Just looking at, the environmental humanities at William & Mary. It's kind of beginning to have this moment. We're getting a track for it next semester, which I'm pretty excited about. So just kind of examining the people and elements of our community that are starting to do really meaningful work. So yeah, I'm excited to get to talk to you.
Yeah.
And we could just jump right in.
That's great. Yeah, sounds good.
So I just wanted to start off, I guess, just right in a broader sense. In retrospect, obviously, you just detailed all this work that you've done, in your career and whatnot. The liberal arts education and whatnot, just in the broadest sense of the term. Do you want to just like speak to maybe some of the more practical, skills and things that you feel like you drew from that as a whole?
Yeah,
now?
definitely. I mean, I guess to begin with, we'll talk more in the broad sense, and I think maybe to hopefully offer like a degree of comfort for those who are also enjoying this amazing liberal arts education right now. And I know in the back of my mind, I always had that slight fear that the work while I was doing it here, I loved it, and I was like working with the most amazing faculty and peers and everything else. But I thought, oh, am I going to have this incredible 4 years and then get out there and be alongside the kids who, were at USC Film School or were at NYU or were doing that, and that they were just sort of going to have all of those doors immediately opened in a way that if you had to explain and connect the dots and articulate what you'd done a little bit more, was that going to be a detriment? And I think I got to talk to Molly a little bit about this beforehand, and I hope it actually makes sense. But the most comforting thing I first saw is that when I, was fortunate enough that would get in an interview for some of these initial internships or something like that, we'd have these really lovely conversations that would sort of be relevant to the project at hand, but sort of go wider, which I think hopefully you all at William & Mary realize that that's kind of a common theme. And we'd get to the end of the conversation and the people would say like, this was so lovely and you've gone a little bit over time, or this is great, but we've, there's sort of like this intangible or this thing that we see when we talk to kids who have this liberal arts background that maybe, it's been a little less like hyper focused in nature while you've been doing your studies. And I don't think they even really knew, but they're like, yeah, it's not the kids who are coming from like the direct film programs and things like that, but we love that there's sort of this broader mindedness towards the way that you think about problem solving and approaching a creative project or things like that. And I think for us coming out of an environment like William & Mary, we know it's because of the nature of the class and the background and the fact that you are in American studies and foreign languages or the sciences like Molly, which that I'm so happy you're here for that, because admittedly that's a world that I think I took one geology class while I was here for like a GRE, and that was AP Bio saved me. And I got here and I did not delve into that world, although Dan, I would have very much loved to. It just wasn't the path. But yeah, so I think was very grateful for that. And then I also can appreciate the ways, like when I went to tackle a project, and this, again, the particular film that I have the document pulled up for was, it did become a feature-length film. It was funded primarily with $5,000 that I had through the program here at William & Mary, and a little bit of additional funding later on, especially as we got into like festival submissions and things like that we can talk about. But even going into the project, the creation of it all was such an amazing experience, because everything that I'd already had at William & Mary was coming into that was sort of drawing aesthetically from certain things from classic cinema. The movie was it was set half in present day, half in the World War II era. And it was about like a present day screenwriter who uncovered a screenplay that had been lost by this writer serving overseas during World War II. And, I guess in its own right, being somewhere like William & Mary, where they didn't tell you, no, you're going to make a feature-length project that's half a period piece and you've got tanks written into your script and like, that's crazy, don't do that, was like a gift in its own right of being here. But was really exciting to get to draw from, these different classes. And some of it, the germ of the idea came from an English class I was taking on Hemingway within the English department that was like biographical details on Hemingway and lost short stories of his that had disappeared on a train, and kind of a germ from that, and certain things that were coming from film history and from actual history that was sort of woven into these American studies courses. And, was just really grateful that all of those elements came into play into crafting the story and kind of having a wider curiosity. And I think that was that sort of intangible that once there started being these interviews and these conversations that would sort of be broader and a little more curious. And if you find the right kind of person who's excited to engage with that and not just talk about kind of the immediate task at hand, that was an exciting element. But
yeah, I'm just so glad you brought that up, because I'm not sure if any of you ever experienced that anxiety as well. But I know when I first started, the film and media program here, I loved it. I absolutely loved it. But I was so anxious that I was going to be behind my peers who, are attending these more like rigorous and specialized film schools. But I think I kind of realized all that technical stuff, but there's no like timeline in terms of when you learn that and like how you can expose yourself to that, because you kind of learn it by doing it.
You do, and it's so ever changing in so many ways also that kind of the environment that you're going to get in. Not every environment, but there are some, especially early on, they're going to be willing to teach you those things, but sort of the intangible curiosity and intellect and willingness to sort of dig into something. And I will say like a hyper sense of organization, which there's always sort of like the romanticized creative who's sort of all over the place. And there are lots of those. And I've had the pleasure of working with lots of those. But if you're the person who will rein that in and keep things on track or be on the back end of sort of having that foresight of what you're going to need to be able to find later, or what's going to be important later, or what needs to be memorialized for other people later on, like that's a huge thing. I feel like that became, and I learned that here, because admittedly with this production diary that we may or may not click through, I didn't fully have that mindset. I had the task at hand of like, okay, we've got the script. We've now shot this project over a summer. I got to collaborate with a lot of fellow students and other alums and actors from the local area, but came out of it, and you know, the lovely powers that be here in swim or elsewhere on my honors committee were like, this is amazing, you've made this film, you're almost done editing this feature, you've lived in an editing room in the media center, but in terms of your actual thesis, like what is the thing that is going to memorialize the process in a thoughtful way and live here at swim in perpetuity and all of that. And a little bit admittedly had to go, some of this was kept very meticulously along the way, some of it had to go back and be kind of reverse constructed in a more thoughtful way of pulling together things that had all existed. But even that exercise in itself, where I think, and I did have peers who, if they were in a direct film program, they were sort of done and then they were done and they said, here's my 15-minute film, and that's the product, and they didn't really have to reflect on any other element of what went into it. And that part is huge. Like another part of my current title on a show like Dear Evan Hansen is sort of laughable, but it was a joke at first and now it's a real thing. It's become like production archivist, because this is a show that's existed since 2012 in some respect or another. And there's video content with, you know, author ownership and metadata and things like that behind it, and photographic content and script variations and drafts and all these different things that kind of lived in different places. But because I've had that continuity with the show, I've sort of always had it in one respect or another. And now they're saying like, how can you build this into a real usable archive as the show is going internationally and it's having so many different forms of life, and there's people who are coming aboard that need to learn the costuming and the press and PR history and all of those kinds of things. So that's something I would have never expected, but this was like the first element of having to wear that hat. So not to like jump ahead of where we are, but that, so I'm so grateful that so much of what happened at William & Mary was like fostering that creativity, but also that like intellectual thought process behind it the whole time.
Yeah, I think putting it like fostering creativity and like intellectual processes is really just important, because you can't like learn that in a classroom, so to speak. And of course, like there are all these film students learning all these technical things and whatnot, but you can't like, you need to be exposed to other people in the world around you and interact with that world in a meaningful way. And I think the liberal arts education kind of forces you to, you know, gain those experiences and whatnot.
Yeah.
And I think that's invaluable moving forward. But your film or your project,
Yes.
that was your undergraduate research or your larger project. And that was, you know, centered in an academic setting. But I was wondering if you could speak to how maybe some of the skills and things you picked up doing that research translated in a professional setting later.
Definitely, for sure. So many things that I was really grateful. I mean, Molly, you touched upon the phrase learn by doing, which I think is so true, and was so lucky in that process. I mean, I had an institution like William & Mary that was validating me and backing me up, because especially once you get to New York and you're doing certain things, like I had a location scouting job early on in New York, and you go around and you say, I'm with this project and with this filmmaker, and they're all like, who, so what? I've talked to 5 people like that this week, and that, you know, it's more commonplace. But here and making this project in this community, and especially having that sort of endorsement of William & Mary that they had greenlit this project and said, yes, go, and this is your use of your funds, and it is a thesis project, opened so many doors to do that learn by doing. And I'd never done something like cast a project before in an official way. I'd done it very unofficially, as some of you may have, that we'd be doing a short for class or this or that, and it's kind of like whoever was on your hall that you could grab and say, hey, you were in a theater production a couple weeks ago or whatever, which I'll say, here, I didn't really do anything with the theater department other than be an avid fan and like went to all the productions and the musicals and Sinfonicon and was like the groupie who saw them all multiple times. But you were kind of interconnected and you could draw upon that talent. But I mean, that experience of reaching out about a project and having to like create these breakdowns for these roles and actually tap into the wider community. And there were some people that could have been accurately portrayed by college students and some who were, parents and grandparents and different things, and some that I had to cast for logistical reasons in like Oklahoma and Texas, because that's where the tanks were. As we said, there were some tanks that played a role in that movie eventually. William and Mary helped with that too, because it's like a reenactors group in Texas. And I said, well, this university's like backed me up to make this film. And I've been a student of history in addition to film and American, and it was all true, but they were like, oh, great. Like you're tapping into what we're up to and you're interested. But so that element was huge. The financial element of it was huge in that, and for those of you who have undertaken certain projects, and Molly, I'm sure you can speak to this, of the first instance of really having to have that like thoughtful accountability for funding that was being made available to you, and certain, again, I'll try to find it later on and we can kind of click through that of just some examples, but having to have actually had that these sort of very thoughtful budgets and timelines and a thoughtful process of how these resources were going to be used and how you were going to be most accountable for everyone else's time, and a larger crew and set of locations and things like that. And that has become one of the hugest things of working in a creative field now, and whether it was helping contribute to like the budgeting and financing of a show like Dear Evan Hansen that obviously is in sort of the multi-millions, and you've got so many stakeholders you're accountable for. Or I've started taking on certain roles as a co-producer myself, which means like you'll get a portion of a show's capitalization that you're responsible for, and you go find a pool of what are known as like accredited investors who want to come aboard and express interest, and you become that person who is sort of their liaison and having to present them with the materials and answer their questions and remain transparent and communicative with them throughout the life of the show. And like all of that was fostered here. But Molly, and I don't know if you've had kind of experience with that thus far, having just done a project of your own and kind of bringing it all to life and the steps to getting to that like ready, set, go.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think definitely, obviously the funding and whatnot, that did work out because of the scholarship and whatnot, but figuring out how to allocate those funds and kind of, I know it sounds like, I guess, very specific and whatnot. And I didn't think necessarily when I set out to create a film project and whatnot, I figured the skill set that I would be building would very much be rooted in the more creative sense. And it definitely was. I mean, having to like create a story and, explore that and whatnot, but so much of it ended up being rooted in, scheduling and contacting people and organize and just gaining like the ability to juggle all of these different things and wear all these kind of different hats temporarily, because, as a college student, you're not like, you don't have a massive crew and whatnot doing all this stuff for you. You're kind of learning how to do those things yourself and whatnot. And I found that actually to be almost more valuable than obviously, again, the creative aspect was incredible, and getting to have the space to do that as well was wonderful. But I think learning about that stuff that you're talking about was 100% like unexpected value for me, for sure. And I think having the space to do it as well in the space of like undergraduate research and whatnot, and not doing it in a space like you said before where it might be more regulated, might be more, and that's not to invalidate or, I think there's so much value to doing that in a film school and whatnot, and doing it with those very specific guidelines and whatnot, where you are doing one specific role. But I think being in a space like this where you're kind of encouraged to figure everything out yourself and kind of try those things
out.
And
I think one element that we haven't talked about, and I think doing a project like this, and I think it'd be true for so many projects at William and Mary, that it kind of fosters a dual sense. I mean, it was really amazing and collaborative. And the fact that I really had free reign to bring aboard the collaborators and, as a co-editor who came in and a director of photography and all these people who had, skill sets that I didn't have, and recognizing also when you do kind of build and foster that team. And I mean, that's the hugest part of, in any production, be it film or theatrical, that you're sort of like building out that wider team who works on a show. And something like Dear Evan Hansen, it started with a couple songwriters and an idea with a lead producer, and then bringing aboard a book writer who's doing the script and the director and which scenic design team members you're going to need, and sort of that collaboration and that discourse, and sometimes the friendly disagreement, and there'll maybe be a persona in the group that thinks that they have the overall vision and everyone's going to fall into line. And when you learn to let go of that, and I know I definitely had that through a research experience and a project experience like this at William & Mary, where early on, it could have been tempting in the setting to think, oh, I've got leeway over this, and, people who come aboard, they're going to kind of fall into step. And when you learn that you do really listen and value and know what others are going to bring to the team, and that, again, that sensibility would be applicable in so many ways. But I think the counterpoint to that, when there's always someone who the buck is inevitably going to stop with, and on a production it could be the lead producer who's sort of that, or a general manager who's like the steward of it all, and they listen and they collaborate, but some decisions are going to fall to them. And that was the nature of a project like this. Like, if it's your thesis, the editor, the DP, or whoever, they don't have that same stake in it. So very quickly, I still will never forget, we had to get out of some location really quickly and somewhere else, and we were breaking down lights and whatever. And we had one lead actor on this project he was not William & Mary affiliated. He was, had come in elsewhere. We used like Mandy.com for casting and had put out notices, and he had an interesting resume and brought him aboard. And so that's probably also a lesson in like working with difficult personalities sometimes too, I'll say, in like the most tactful way possible. And he saw it, and I was jumping in and like breaking down some lights or doing whatever. And he's like, Caitlin, you're the director of this project. That's not your job. What are you doing? And that was such an interesting mindset, because I mean, in some regimented hierarchy of things, he would be correct, but that felt so counterintuitive and counterproductive. And at least in creative environments I've gotten to work in since then, was so the opposite of what's actually going to help further you along. And I think about random stuff that I've done thus far, and random stuff that people I respect have kind of jumped in and done, and for the benefit of the end product and this creative thing that you're making or whatever it is. So grateful that early on there was that sort of mixed sense of being collaborative with everyone else in the way of like bringing their skills to the table, but also being willing to be fully collaborative yourself and participatory, and not sort of like live within these lines. Obviously, there are certain points where stay in your lane is very true, and you let people do what's going to do best when they shine. But if it's like the little stuff that you think is beneath you, like I learned very quickly that getting rid of that mindset is going to be beneficial in so many ways in the long run.
Yeah, I think that's such a wonderful point to make as well, just because I think, especially among like, and maybe this is just my observation, but I think a lot of the time I see among like creative people and young creative people, when we're first starting to like get out there and figure out what our voice is and how we want to communicate that, there's this idea or misconception that the creative process is a very individual one. And that's where like these difficult personalities and stronger mindsets and whatnot come into play, because there are people who, especially I think when you are in like a more, I don't know, rigorous film setting and whatnot, where you're kind of encouraged to really hone in on your own voice and what that is, and you're not encouraged to be as collaborative, and there's this competitive spirit, so to speak, and no less of a collaborative one. I think that can be a major drawback. And I think here at William & Mary, when you're taking a film class and whatnot, like you can guarantee that every other student in that room, whether they're film and media studies major or not, they have taken classes you've never taken, and they have studied things you've never studied. They know things that you don't. And that's just something you learn right off the bat. And it's not a negative thing. It's something that I think our professors and whatnot can encourage you to get really excited about, because there are going to be people that you get to work with and talk to that are going to teach you things and inspire you in ways that you can't do by yourself. So you ultimately leave here with this kind of mindset kind of ingrained, whether like it's conscious or subconscious. And I think that's like, in terms of like what research or just, liberal arts in general, that's invaluable.
And on something like your film project that you did more recently, what kind of wider team was it that came in or came aboard on that? And admittedly, I've had like less experience in the doc realm and more in sort of like narrative fiction stuff like this, that I'm curious to hear kind of what that process was. And I know you had sort of, when I was talking about liaising with talent, you have interview subjects and sort of experts that you're bringing in that, and if there are any kind of different takeaways from that process.
Yeah, honestly, it was kind of, it's on the flip side of kind of your experience, because you said, you know, there was so much that you did with a crew and whatnot in production wise. So when it comes to documentary, it's definitely a very tighter, smaller thing, because most of the people that I'm working with are like my interview subjects. So most of it was just me and my director of photography, and you know, occasionally someone else, but it was really just the two or three of us at any given moment. So on the fly, I didn't get as much of that experience. But in terms of the actual content itself and whatnot, it was this entire thing of, you know, finding these people in general, because it's not like I can just set out like a casting call, so to speak, or anything, like looking for people who know about this kind of stuff. It was honestly a process of years of taking these courses and honestly like getting to know these professors and whatnot, and finding this story. But then, you know, just months of talking to students over and over, and like kind of already acknowledging that as much as, I mean, I am an environmental humanities major, this is something I'm very excited about. I don't know everything there is to know about it, and I can't tell that story. That's why I'm making, you know, that's why I'm making this project or whatever. I don't know everything. I can't communicate it all by myself. So I need to find and assemble a group of people who know what I don't. So a large part of that was just kind of, it was a collaboration in a different sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the through line, whether it is expertise on a subject matter or it's a particular skill set or familiarity with certain equipment or whatever it may be, that yes, recognizing those things and kind of assembling the best team or group or set of subjects and experts around you is kind of like one of the hugest skill sets and mindsets you can develop early on. And you know, and I know there's some environments where you maybe get assigned to that again, or in a more traditional like production-based setting. From what I've heard, obviously I didn't go through that, but from friends who have, and they're like, oh yeah, well, I just got assigned an editor and assigned a DP and assigned this and that, and you know, we're all told to work together on this thing and say go. Hey Brian, how's it going? Good to see you. So, and you know, and that they had some certain really helpful takeaways no matter what, but when you are in that role of sort of thoughtfully being in a position to assemble that and sort of network and look at the overall pieces of that puzzle, yeah, was a huge takeaway from coming out of this.
And I mean, I was just thinking of this as you're speaking about, you know, this collaboration afterwards. And I think this is really the nature of any undergraduate research, obviously a film specifically, but once you're done, you know, creating that product, I guess it's a bit twofold, and that's my question, I suppose, is gonna take two forms. But firstly, I mean, there's this whole idea that once you're done filming one, you're not done, and you don't, you know, have the final creative say, so to speak, because if you're doing it under a professor, you're working with someone else, you know, there is this other person that, you know, you're looking to for advice and, you know, for guidance, so to speak. Maybe your peers. I know in my experience, at least with this project, like I've been working on, it's been really rewarding to find, you know, people that I trust, or, you know, other students, other professors, to see and give me feedback and talk to me about it. And I think when you're in a creative field and whatnot, and you're being creative, it's really important to be able to receive feedback and
Completely.
you know,
Yeah. I mean, that like kill your
So,
darling spray again on a project like this. I was one of the like hugest assets was this classmate of mine named Austin, who's like an editor extraordinaire. And he came aboard because at first I was like, am I just going to be, you know, technically, thanks to William and Mary, I have the skills to go about this. And I would maybe even have the time to go about this, but it's really, so we kind of shared a co-editor role, which was interesting and maybe a little more unorthodox at the time or something, but was so grateful for someone like him who, you know, we'd already made certain edits in the script, and then things are going to happen in post-production too. And the conversations we'd have where we, you know, would come in and he's like, Caitlin, that's really got it. I know you shot it, you wanted to see what happened with it, like, it's really got to go. And, you know, these conversations we'd have that were, you know, tricky and interesting, and sometimes it'd be that spirited debate, but I was so happy to have that sort of collaborator in that way who could kind of keep things in check and not get you lost in your own head. And you hear that so much. I mean, in being in the process of Dear Evan Hansen, and obviously I, was in a supporting nature on that team and wasn't the creative or the creator of that thing, but favorite songs and things that have sort of been lost along the way in the wayside, and having that sort of friendly and rational debate and dialogue about that kind of thing is huge. Yeah. And I mean, and in the after, you're so right that there's not, like, it doesn't just end when it's done. And I was lucky. I mean, another thing that we haven't really touched upon in terms of these creative careers, and something that I kind of had to wrap my head around, is that depending on the role you're in, so much of it is going to be about creating the thing, but then cultivating the audience for that thing. And I think early on, I mean, I did it here without even thinking about it, because I found a fellow student who was somehow I don't even remember what his major was, but he was a whiz at press releases and things like that. So we got together and he's like, well, I'm going to write you a press release for this screening at the Kimball Theater. And we created, this is where I really feel old and date myself, that it felt like such a novel concept that we had a Facebook fan page at the time to even connect with the, and now you're like, oh my gosh, this is only 11 years ago. But some of that is in here. Let me see if I can find where it was, and it's so comical, and had a whole website that was created on Tumblr. Again, I'm going to try to find a few of those, because they're so delighted and dated looking in certain respects, but it also was so valuable. Pardon me as I awkwardly juggle these two computers. And that was such a huge learning experience, and something that became hugely valuable within all of this too, was having to be the person who will promote these things. I'll find it in a little bit, but we had all of this, in a local, there was someone, we had the Flat Hat come in, and someone from her campus, I don't even know if that exists anymore, but a publication that came in and did a few things, and having to then wear that hat and that mindset, and I was grateful that there were people around me too. I mean, I had the vested interest, it was screening here and I wanted eyeballs to come on it, and that kind of thing. But having that team who, someone just put a message in there.
It was to the people on the Zoom call.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Dan. Having that lesson at the end of all of it, Molly, when you said what comes after, and I'll be curious to hear kind of what your thoughts are, but especially because it was something that was in, the fiction realm, and something that we hope to take to festivals later and things like that, that it was the first lesson. And then finding that way to sort of market this thing that you've created, or find those collaborators around you that are going to have the skills to do that, and to put out the release for you, or to help capture content. We had some really lovely high school age interns from around the area who came in. And again, this is something that I kind of reverse engineered and learned from, because now anything you do in the creative field, there's going to be the other person that's you're doing the thing, but then who's capturing the content of the thing to put out there and promote. And it's can sometimes get a little cringy and gross, but it's also hugely important of how these things kind of find their audience. And we were really lucky that we had that, because they had this amazing team of interns that were, one was a script supervisor, and one would jump in and do sound or location-based stuff. And, one, yes, had to go pick up the lunches on occasion, because you had a lot of people to feed, and, a big portion of a budget can go to that inherently. But the fact that one of them, I'd sort of said, you're going to have, here's this camera, and you've got a great eye, and you're charged with sort of capturing the behind the scenes sorts of things, and the still photos or whatever. And now things that, you think there are whole teams that are devoted to the arts, and then the teams that are devoted to supporting and promoting and capturing the arts of these, some of the biggest companies we work for are the ones that are the digital agencies, and they're running content for production channels and channels of nonprofit theaters and all of that. And obviously in the film side of things, that's so huge too, with, just the marketing and campaigns and award seasons and all of that. So that was, again, one of those lessons that kind of came full circle after. And then the film did play at various festivals, kind of even post-graduation for about a year. So we needed, again, the world has changed so much now, but even that learning experience of what we needed to engage with these festivals and materials that we needed, and all of that was hugely valuable. And part of that was thanks to the way that William and Mary had set it up of like, figure out how you're documenting this whole process. And like, yes, we need it in academic setting, but you need it in that creative setting too, of how you kind of give your thing a life. And then did kind of a whole second set of fundraising through like Indiegogo at the time, but now there's, so many channels that people go about that. But that was kind of to get a whole other set of funding from people who came aboard to like support the festival circuit and festival submissions and creation. Again, it like dates it all so much that we were still having to create DVDs and actually like send things at the time. And now I would imagine, I have not gone through that process in quite a while. I would imagine you would be laughed out of a room for sending a DVD in many settings. Brian, I don't know if you've been doing like festival submissions recently or whatever.
Oh, no, not lately.
Yeah,
I'm
anyway.
not sure. I would probably do it digitally. if
I
were
know,
to do
exactly,
it.
yeah. But I think about, all of that we needed to support that process. And again, have that like communication and transparency within that whole other set of investors that the supporters that came aboard and said, we're going to give that vote of confidence. And they weren't even hoping for anything in return other than like a DVD with some commentary we recorded and like some updates along the way. But now, when I engage with investors on the regular who have contributed $10,000, $25,000 to a project, and they feel like they're entitled to those updates and that transparency. And, ultimately they hope also a return of capital and then a return of profit, and that, it's going to have kind of come out to be a fruitful thing for them. But so those skills are like being cultivated in a way that I didn't even fully realize or put my finger on until later. And I've seen, colleagues and people I've worked for that maybe haven't honed that level of communication or accountability, and they start getting angry voicemails from some guy on Long Island who says like, I gave you my $25,000 6 months ago and I haven't heard anything from you. And they all feel like this connection and sort of a sense of entitlement or a need for that accountability. So, but Molly, so like, what are the plans for your project that you've created and sort of where it's headed after?
Yeah, it's definitely taking on a little bit of a different life than yours, just because again, it is very much rooted in William and Mary and this second hat that I wear for environmental humanities, because I have spent so much time and energy into, growing that and, getting excited about that kind of thing. So right now I'm going to be showing it at an undergraduate research event this month.
Nice.
Actually in like 2 weeks, April 20th. So that is kind of I'm going to show it in conjunction with this whole launch event for this new track. So it is a little bit different because in a larger sense, it is very much a promotional piece for this thing. So definitely afterwards, it's I kind of have questions about what I'm going to do with it. I'm not going to do, a festival circuit or anything like that, because it is very much rooted in William and Mary.
But I mean, that's the whole kind of
Yeah.
skill set. And I mean, if we're really putting this in the nitty gritty of like the creative careers and knowing the people that I've encountered in the arts world, or the people who work in these agencies that touch film and theater, and like someone who has created that project that has sort of that very specific context and setting in mind is so hugely valuable. And it also shows that like you with your own creative eye and vision can then like also let that happen alongside this context or this mission or this thing that you're trying to support. And so much, these amazing teams that we work with who, they're wonderful filmmakers in their own right, but then they're coming aboard to support a production with various pieces, whether it's like an award season interview piece, or it's a piece that's in relation to a not-for-profit partner. Like we do a lot of work with mental health partners. So obviously there becomes a whole separate, deeper mission and sort of narrative there when you bring those partners aboard, and having that sensibility and having that thing that you can kind of contextualize that way, that you already have created like this beautiful, compelling piece of content that has lived in that setting and served that mission, I think becomes hugely appealing to people too, who think, oh, am I going to get like a rogue creative in here who's just going to do their own thing and not be mindful of the context and everything else about where you're using that. So when you say it's different and whatever, I think there's, hugely valuable elements of that many people, especially with the right like spin and angle put on it, would realize what a valuable element that is of having worked within that setting.
Yeah, and I think just even though they are, like I said, sort of different in their, what they're gonna do moving, or what they did moving forward, I think there's really something to be said in doing it here at William and Mary, because I think, having the, space to just kind of do, I mean, I don't know, all the, especially from what I'm like you've detailed about your own work in your own project. I mean, it's a lot, and there's a lot of different facets, it sounds like a really massive undertaking. And I think if you had told me like about this kind of stuff when I was a freshman, when I first arrived here, it would sound so big and so out of my reach, that I would be like, I could never do something like that. But the reality is that
it did to me
yeah.
too. I mean, I remember, and thank goodness for people like Kim and Dan and like the amazing faculty that I worked with here at William and Mary, who also are in that setting of like encouraging you in the right time. Because yes, if you get out into a certain setting in the career mode and you are sort of overwhelmed by that, they're going to be sort of like, all right, yeah, but get over it, because we're going to find someone who doesn't feel overwhelmed by the scope of all of this. But yeah, I mean, there were so many moments, and we're like packing up a trailer or carload of stuff in Oklahoma of these like World War II uniforms and all these random props and all these things you put together, and had this moment of like, what the heck, what am I doing? And like suddenly I'm showing up tomorrow and all these people are looking for that, guidance or leadership or whatever. And I think that was the greatest gift of a setting like that at William and Mary. And I think that's true, in any field and whatever kind of project or undertaking that people are taking on here, is having that setting that is really going to empower you, but also like give you that boost and that like, yeah, you got this, keep going. Cause you will quickly find the people that are like, again, do the thing, have the confidence in yourself and whatnot. So hugely appreciative of that setting also.
Yeah, and I think just doing it at a university or like college that stresses undergraduate research so heavily, I mean, of course, I think when we talk about undergraduate research, you don't think of these creative iterations as often, but this very much is research, and there's support, there's institutional support, there's professors who want to encourage you and help you achieve those things. Whereas, like at maybe a larger research university and stuff like that, if you're not a grad student, you're not at like NYU grad school. I mean, of course, that's an entirely different world and whatnot, but as an undergraduate, and especially like when you're just figuring things out and whatnot, even at like a larger film school, it's all film students who all want to work on these projects. You're not going to have a professor you have a personal relationship with, who is used to working with undergraduates and is really invested in the success of said undergraduates. So like these larger undertakings, as much as they sound really like daunting maybe at first, being at a school that is so heavily, ingrained in this world of undergraduate research, it sets you up to be able to achieve those things or take these larger undertakings, because you're going to have people who really want you to, which I think I didn't realize, but I'm glad I did, in time to like do this and whatnot.
And
because
I think, I know we've talked a lot about the unique nature of something like a film project and how that fits, and same for you, but I know there were certain things, because you've had like film studies majors in here, and I don't know how much it's been like production based versus the more scholarly approach to film studies in that way. I mean, what for you all who are here, has it been kind of a balance or a mix, or?
For most of my classes, I feel like we're really theory heavy, and then like we have like the 3 courses where you take like production, screenwriting. Because my time mostly was in COVID because I was a transfer, I didn't have as many. I think a lot of classes were taken away because of that. So I don't know if there's more options. If Molly, if you had a different experience.
I mean, mine was mostly, theory up to a certain point until I started like taking those production classes and whatnot. I think a lot of my production experience actually came from not the classroom setting, but meeting other students who were like in here, or, like doing that work of their own, or, doing their own research. Because honestly, that's something to be said about research. There's other people doing that stuff as well.
And I will say because, I, apart from this project, the bulk of sort of my day-to-day classwork and even what I went and did in a master's degree afterwards was very much the same, that it was kind of in that realm of theory and history, and something that it could be easy to maybe write off as being less applicable once you get out of an academic setting. And I'll say like that so couldn't be more true. I mean, in the basics that you wouldn't even really think about, but once you get into a role on the back end and you're at all in like the producer admin side, like so much of it is again just that communication and that transparency, and you don't even think about what a value it is when like you're going to be the person in that office who just like can draft really like effective and empathetic and like, you know, communication towards these large groups of people, and it feels so obvious. And suddenly you're working on people who are like, can you draft that email? Because I don't even want to have to do it. And you know, it seems so simple, but it's also like the wrong thing in an email is going to trigger someone who's then going to get angry and storm off or whatever. So, you know, there's a lot that rides on that of those skills as just a writer and a communicator that comes from here that I would, and, you know, not even certainly in a creative respect. And I love when I still have opportunities to do that, whether in the work setting or kind of tangential to the work setting. But, you know, you kind of forget how hugely valued that is until you're around people who didn't have that same sort of rigor of what they were doing, especially if it was writing heavy in a more theory-based sense or whatnot, and kind of what all that develops in you. But also I know I had certain elements of like research that were more on page, you know, they weren't like a project like this, and there, you know, a lot of it was tied to like the earliest iterations of this film festival. And when it first started, and like its very first year was about the 75th anniversary of moviegoing in Williamsburg. So there was a whole student staff at the festival who in this like independent study class were tasked with digging into years and years worth of microfilm from like the Virginia Gazette or Williamsburg, what would it have been? The local, yeah. And
Use it.
yeah, and trying to find like these movie listings and piecing together a complete, because the Kimball didn't have it. And we were trying to figure out so we could build an effective program for this festival of what all had been there. And it was thrilling at the time with the end goal. And, you know, some people would, I remember the first time they told me you're going and you're going to be like getting on microfilm and whatever. And I was like, that sounds horrifying. And you know, just like the archives and databases and things you have access to here. And in theory that a lot of people have access to, but maybe, especially depending on the creative path they take, don't have a reason to really dive into that. And you get into something like a producer's office or a setting I've been in, and they're talking about wanting to dig into considering a revival of a production or this or that or whatnot. And you meet so many people that sort of have the mindset of like, well, if I can't readily Google it and find it on the first 2 pages of results, it means it's not out there. So when you're having to put together either a compelling background or overview for like creative collaborators you're looking for, or like we have to do a lot of these sorts of presentations for investors or, you know, fellow co-producers that you're courting. And if you're trying to show the critical reception or sort of the cultural context of something, or even just finances of how it fared the first time, or all these things that people get convinced aren't as much at your fingertips as they are if you haven't sort of come up in a setting like this of knowing that. So many things that they would sort of say, you know, there were some that came to fruition, some that didn't, but revivals of old plays that hadn't been seen in New York since the 1950s or whatever. And we were trying to kind of like remind people of its relevance and but also its sort of storied history and all of that, and things that you can uncover and sort of make compelling in that way that you wouldn't expect to necessarily factor into things. And a lot of it does go into sort of all of that prep. So like this kind of thing that I had to make afterwards in a reflective sort of way, a lot of times you're making to tee something up and get the people aboard and sort of give that wider context that they're not necessarily going to take the time to go seek out themselves. They just want you to put it in front of them in a compelling 2 to 3 pages or whatnot. So yeah, anyway, so that element, because I realized like the film part is, you know, unique. It was a very unique opportunity and sort of one thing that came through this path. But I think there are so many elements of that are of wider importance. Has it already almost been an hour? Dang,
Yeah.
that's wild. But are there questions? I mean, Molly, I don't know if there's anything else or if there's questions from this group of.
I mean, I'm good with it. I was just gonna say, because you kind of were almost
I know you're
into that. I
yeah.
was just gonna say, as we like close off, I was wondering if you just wanted to touch on, like, I know obviously, you know, if you weren't doing a film and what there were other things that you were involved in while you were here and whatnot, maybe they might not have been like research in the most direct sense, but I was just wondering if you wanted to share maybe some of the other
And yeah,
things you're
that's
involved in
that's
at William and Mary.
oh, for sure. I mean, that was part of it with this festival, and that was huge. There's a project called the Williamsburg Documentary Project that we got sent off very early on to go do these oral histories of like movie going in Williamsburg. And, you know, I was a 19-year-old who only had a bike at the time, and they're like, here's this lady's address and she's 87 years old, and go engage with her and do. And I mean, you know, so many skill sets that I would think of there, of sort of whether it is fostering those investor relations or things that I've had to do on the PR side of things, or I've been told like that's a persnickety actor and we need this Q&A for a playbill that runs tomorrow and no one else is there, so go like take a recorder and talk to them in the dressing room or whatever. And, you know, it kind of has you ready for all of that on a dime. I mean, separate from all this, like I worked with AMP for 4 years too while I was here, and I mean that was huge for sure, of a lot of these same mindsets of kind of the budgeting and the contracting and all of those elements. So yeah, there's like all the pieces of the puzzle that'll for sure come together. But are there any questions from this gang before we hit the end of our hour? And Molly, I know at whatever point you have class and have to
Yeah,
make
no
your exit
worries.
too, but yeah.
I had a question. This kind of like steers more towards the future. I'm considering grad school. I wondered like how you felt like going into a master's program helped your career, if you found it as useful. Because I know a lot of people say like you don't have to, but like we were talking about how having that background in research and theory was really helpful. So do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, well, part of me, I'm very grateful that I went to NYU, because as sort of a semi-anxious person who also really loved academia and really thrived in academia while also loving doing things like this, like it was sort of that baby step that got me to New York, and they were admittedly generous with some funding, so it made it a little less hard to try to make a decision of, is this rational or is this completely crazy or whatnot, because it isn't that credential that you need in the state. I mean, I guess if you're going to go, I had colleagues there, you know, classmates there who wanted to get that PhD and teach in a film studies program or a media studies or, you know, American studies, that kind of thing. And that was a different ballgame. And I think my answer to this would be so different than so many people I went to school with, only because William & Mary was just that good, that I got to NYU and you think like, oh, the cinema studies program at Tisch is going to just sort of like be William & Mary on steroids or whatever. And so much of it felt like ground that it either had already been covered here or had been covered like differently, but in a more compelling way and with like more meaningful faculty engagement. So that's, you know, nothing against NYU. It was an amazing program. You know, I was grateful for the faculty. I was grateful for sort of having that network within New York as well. But what you get here, and I'm not trying to say that as like shill, I have nothing to gain by that. I'm just saying that like, depending on the path, and I think if you were then going to go into something that was production based or heading into, you know, mine was an MA as opposed to an MFA, that would probably be different in terms of once you're at that graduate level, the skill sets or the sort of the connections, the networking you'd make within that cohort. I have friends and colleagues who, you know, have had huge doors open to them because of that. So I realize it's very personal, but in terms of having that background, unless you're trying to head towards that certain path with the end goal, I found that what had happened here was so hugely valuable, informative, and that's only just to say, like, again, the attention you're going to get as an undergrad and everything that's happened here, it measured up pound for pound, like amazingly. And so again, I was very grateful for that experience, but it didn't, and that it got me there. And, you know, in a city that it could be hard to jump into cold, although many people do. And I was grateful that there was sort of that academic network that had inroads into sort of other artistic communities in New York and that kind of thing. But in terms of the actual classroom elements, and I mean, a lot of times that is the reality of it, that it's, you know, who you're in the room with and the people you're around and whatnot. But just as much, there's an amazing alumni network of William & Mary people in New York and who are here for the festival. And so you can be in the rooms with those kinds of people anyway. So it's, I don't know if that really helps, but it's a very good question. Yeah. But I think the biggest thing is like what you've gotten here is already going to like, have given you so many, the skills that I felt like I needed for the job from that realm would have already come from here and didn't necessarily need to be further cultivated through that setting, although I'm grateful for things that I learned. And, you know, they had like an archiving and preservation offshoot that I took as many classes in that I could without having officially applied for that program. Mm-hmm. And that's like more specified in a skill set that you really would like need to cultivate there. And, you know, if I'd been more aware of that at the time, maybe that would have, you know, who knows how that would have changed, but yeah.
And what was the specific program you were part of?
I did the MA in cinema studies at NYU in Tisch. So they have, MFA programs in writing and production, but then I did kind of that very specific track that was sort of coming out of the academic, the more theory-based world that was here that I really loved. And there were more practical applications for it here than there were there actually, because I was working with things like this festival and all of that, it felt like it had more avenues in this setting because there were so many people opening so many doors if you cared to kind of like peek around it and ask. So, any other questions? This group? Yeah.
I was just wondering, like, how did you make the jump from film to theater? And like, did you ever feel like sometimes I struggle with, like, I'm a music major and a lot of times the career path that I want to take, you don't necessarily need a degree for. Did you ever feel that kind of like, when you made the jump, oh, I guess like in retrospect, I didn't need all of this training. Not that any of it was that it was all useful, but did you ever struggle with that?
No, I think it was more just finding the things that weren't in that world already that they maybe needed in their orbit. Because like the first internship I got in theater was a producer who was known mostly for doing theater, but those things take a very long time to cultivate. So she decided she wanted to try to develop some TV projects on the side because they could in theory move more quickly than capitalizing a Broadway show and waiting for a theater and whatnot. So the thing that I had on my resume that got me in the door was really the fact that I knew how to like use Final Cut and edit, and they didn't care that I was or wasn't a production major or whatever, in the concentration, just that I'd said like, yeah, I can do, they were doing like little sizzle reels and things for pitching investors and trying to bring them aboard. And so I think it's very much, and I think they had resumes from plenty of theater majors. And I know I've done that now when we've been hiring in our office too. And the things that we've tried to fill in, and we found people who like were maybe just out of college and had communications degrees and did have those chops in like graphic design or, crafting press releases and PR related things or things that like could be used to beef up our team. So I think more often you're going to find that inroads of that skill set that you cultivated somewhere a little different. And that, at least in my case, proved helpful of kind of why they said, okay, you don't have that traditional like BA in theater, BFA, whatever it may be on your resume. And then they were willing to teach some of the other stuff that I didn't, so much of this terminology, I had no idea when it went in, and they'd talk about a company manager or a co-producer, the capitalization of it. And I was like, I don't know what any of this means, but they were happy because there was something else that I could bring to the table that, they didn't even know they had a need for until later on. But